Good morning. My name is Jonas Sonnenschein. I work for Umanotera, the Slovenian Foundation for Sustainable Development, and we are one of the organizations supporting also the implementation of this conference. I hope you came back with lots of energy. The third day of our summer school. I think we had 2 very successful days. Today the topic will be sustainable consumption, production and degrowth. And we have in the morning program 3 very exciting lectures. As the other days, we will start with the lecture and then allow questions both from the live audience and also from Zoom. Today the presentations will be a bit shorter, so that's why I also will only say a few words about our presenters. We start the day with Kersty Hobson. We're very happy to have her on Zoom. Very sad that she cannot be with us here in Ljubljana. She's a reader in human geography at the University of Cardiff, has published widely in the field of socio-environmental transformation, and more recently focused her work on the circular economy. And this is also the topic of today's talk. And without further ado, I invite Kersty to start her presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, am I screen sharing or is somebody else showing the slides?
I think the idea is that you can screen share.
Okay, all right. Well, I didn't realize that. Hold on. Sorry, everybody. You just have to give me a minute here while I sort myself out. And I'm going to try and talk while doing that. No, actually, that's a bad idea. It will end badly. As you can hear, I'm quite croaky, so I apologize for not being able to be there. My mind was willing, but my body was not able. Right.
So in the meanwhile, I can tell you that we are maybe roughly 30, 40 people already here, and people are still dropping in.
Okay. All right.
We have 35 participants, so.
Great. All right, I'm getting there. Screen share. There we go. Share screen. There it is. Right, can you see that?
Yes, we see it and we hear you very well. So.
Lovely. All right, let's start now. All right, sorry about that, everybody. Again, apologies for not being able to be there. And if I have to stop and cough, it's how things are. Anyway, yes, so I'm Kersty Hobson. I'm at the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University in Wales, as the introduction just said. I'm an environmental social scientist, background anthropology and human geography. And I've been basically thinking about why it is we've ended up how we are in terms of our own consumption in relation to the environment. You know, we know so much about what's wrong environmentally speaking, and yet we carry on consuming the way we do. I mean, I know that's a very sort of simplistic way of putting it, but that's what I've been thinking about for the last while. But as already been mentioned, I've been thinking about the circular economy for the last sort of decade or so now. I won't give you a background as to how I got into that, but let's just think about what the circular economy is. I'm sure you probably are already aware. It's this notion, this framework that has sort of risen in the last decade or so around the idea, well, we have to actually fundamentally rethink our model of production and consumption. So these ideas of sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, etc. So the idea is that we have to move from that linear economy. We are currently in what we might call a recycling economy, and that's just not adequate. And I could talk at length about what's wrong with recycling. I'm sure you already know that it's not the ideal situation. And if we think about, I don't know if you know, like the hierarchy of R's that go from refuse, you know, all the way down, all the R's, remanufacturing, repair, etc. Recycling is basically the bottom, so it's the last thing we want to be doing, but it's the thing we're doing the most of. So, and here in Wales, we have the third or the fourth highest global recycling rate, but we're still hitting only about 65%. So it's still not great, even if we are recycling. Anyway, so that's that. Oops, hold on. There we go. Another way of representing the circular economy is this diagram. You may have seen this. It's called the butterfly diagram. It's, you know, with the wings and the body down the middle. So this is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And it's their way of pictorially representing the different facets of the circular economy. So I won't talk you through it all, obviously, we haven't got enough time for that, but you can see those loops there all the way down from manufacturing to the user and the consumer, and the loops that go back. So you have on the right, I tend to focus more on the right than on the left. You have repairing, maintenance, reuse, and again, recycle is the biggest loop. Basically, what we can take from there is the bigger the loop, the less environmentally friendly the practice. With a big question mark after that comment, because it's not necessarily always the case. I mean, one thing that's definitely worth pointing out here is that the idea of the circular economy has been around for decades, like since the 1960s. Various practitioners and researchers have been talking about our production consumption systems being highly wasteful and inefficient, but they've come very much from different areas. So sustainable design, industrial ecology. So in many ways, circular economy was never actually meant to be a whole framework to retrofit a global economic system. So in many ways, ironically, it's been recycled or repurposed itself as a solution to the current environmental or socio-economic crises we find ourselves in. So that's worth keeping in mind in terms of the origins of that. And certainly industrial ecology as a field talked more about industrial symbiosis. So basically more localized practices. How do we create sort of local ecosystems of production and consumption that are circular? It was never meant to be a global framework that it has become. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense. So the next question is, well, so what about all of this? Well, the big so what is that actually it has become very predominant framework across the world in terms of how we approach socioeconomic challenges. So you may be aware the European Union has a circular economy action plan. It has since 2015. Then it got recast in 2020-21 in terms of the idea of the Green Deal and the green recovery. We also have Canada, China, various, Amsterdam, the Netherlands has been doing a lot of work, South Korea, etc. So it's not just an academic exercise in drawing nice diagrams, it is very much a framework that's been taken forward. But of course, taking it forward depends very much on the context, i.e. what the circular economy in Canada looks like is very different from what it might look like in China. For example, I have a PhD student, Megan O'Byrne, who's looking at the difference between Wales and Ireland in terms of the circular economy. And they are countries of similar size, very close to each other, like you can get across on the ferry in reasonable time. And yet their approach to the circular economy is very different. Ireland is still very much an agricultural export economy. Wales to a point, but it has actually been changing in terms of its industries. So they have a very different way of thinking about the extent of the circular economy. So there isn't one, there's lots of circular economies is a better way of thinking about it. I'm not going to go into this because that's a lot, but why I put this here is to basically say that this is from the European Action Plan and from various documents from the EU. And it's just to underscore that there is a lot happening around this, this framework. We could be here all day if we were to try and unpack this, and I'm certainly not going to. I just wanted to make the point that it's not just a badge that's been attached to existing policies. There has been substantive rethinking. So I'm not just going to sit here and be rude about what's happening at the European Union. It is actually quite interesting and impressive, and I would encourage you to go away and have a look in terms of what's going on. Lots of work, as you can just read there, green claims. So there's been work happening around greenwashing, trying to stop companies making claims. There's a lot of that going on, so the consumer actually knows what they're buying, around packaging, around plastics, etc. So it's very hard to offer a kind of overarching analysis of all of this. And so if I say one thing, is to encourage you all to think about doing some more work on these different policies and having a look and doing some analysis, because we need more researchers actually critically engaging with the specifics of what's going on. That aside, I'm just going to go and contradict myself now and say I'm going to make an overarching sort of comment. For all of that, it is still very much a weak agenda. And what I mean by weak, hopefully you're familiar with the debates about strong and weak sustainability, and the notion of weak sustainability was very much around trying to encapsulate approaches that are incremental. So you shift a bit here, you shift a bit there, you deal with systems in isolation. So it's quite piecemeal and not in any way really addressing the underlying issues. So certainly if you look around the world at various circular economy policies that are having real world impacts, and billions is being spent on all of this action, it is still very much a weak agenda, because it's prompted by geopolitical and regional competitiveness issues. Again, if you look at the European Union, but also in Wales, where I live, the framing and the language that's up front with these policies is very much about having to remain economically competitive into this century where we face multiple challenges. And one of those is definitely geopolitical tensions. And as we're seeing more and more acutely around the world, the sort of unfolding of who has access to what resources. And there's real concern about mineral scarcity and resource scarcity, given where resources are found. Anyway, so if you're coming from that position, you probably will have a very different agenda than if you're coming from a social justice position. And certainly I've not been alone in my sort of critical take on the circular economy. There's really some interesting work now. One paper I always go back to is Zinc and Gaia, or Gaia, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, that was published in the Journal of Industrial Ecology, thinking more about the rebound effects and the system levels for the circular economy. And their fundamental point is that if secondary production, i.e. all the stuff that goes through a system and comes out to be recycled and remanufactured and refurbished, isn't actually then displacing primary production, i.e. new goods, and actually what we're going to get in a circular economy is an increase in resource use and energy use. So the notion of that is really, really important. Displacement is really important, i.e. are we using all these secondary goods that have come out of the system, going back down to loop, instead of primary production, rather than as well as. And that's a large scale system perspective, but to bring it back down perhaps to an example we might all may be to understand, if you go on to like Etsy, like I've got a picture of Etsy there, I love Etsy, full of really funky stuff, and you buy a nice upcycled object, you're browsing, you go, oh, that's nice, that's a nice chair for my garden. If you're buying that instead of going to a hardware store and getting a chair, that's fine. But if you're buying it as well as buying the chair from the hardware store, you're actually increasing consumption. And this is one of the things we are seeing. Upcycled stuff is lovely, but actually there's no sense that it's displacing primary production and purchase. And that's what happens when we think in a weak way, because we're looking at individual systems, we're looking at how various products go through in isolation. We're not able to see that holistically, then what happens. That is a major problem that's being highlighted. My own work hasn't focused so much on that sort of system level. Excuse me. It's been more focused on the consumer user, all of us, basically, everyone sat in that room and on Zoom, and we're all consumer users in a circular economy to some extent. And when you look at the policy and the literature and everything that's been written around it, there's an interesting kind of persona, object, this subject of the circular economy that we are starts to emerge. And it's this person who is willing to accept or buy into new business models. So it's quite a passive actor, if you like, who goes into a shop and has these number of choices and is a sort of semi-rational consumer, files through all that information in their head and goes, oh, I'll have that one. And it's the job of businesses and government to sort of nudge us towards that moment of purchase. But at the same time, we're all able and willing to share and pool resources, i.e. the sharing economy. And they're not necessarily the same kind of psychological or cognitive processes. And yet we are being sort of framed as embodying all of that, which is interesting because it's argued that all of this, as far as you and I are concerned, is nothing but great. It's a win-win for us all because it delivers greater convenience. You know, you can click on Uber and suddenly a car turns up. That's great. If we consider that a sharing economy, we can talk about that. And there's a lot made about all the sort of social connections and well-being that comes through the sharing economy, which does not have much behind it in terms of literature and research. So why am I telling you all this? Well, one of the interesting things in terms of, you know, thinking about how do we make the circular economy more radical, or what can we do with this? It's happening, it's real. How can we be a part of actually turning it from weak to strong? Starts with thinking about comments like this. So this report on the consumer in the circular economy talked about making this transition as frictionless as possible for consumers. Only then will companies encourage mass engagement with circular practices and succeed in capturing all of the gains on offer of circular models. And this notion of frictionless is one I want to take forward and think about a bit more. Hold on, there we go. Because how's it going? How are we all, as the users, consumers in this circular economy, reacting? Again, there is some interesting work, and this is pre-pandemic, but actually the evidence is suggesting that as we come out of sort of lockdowns, not that much has really changed. And it found that basically, whereas there's a lot of willingness to engage, so this is the problem with a lot of the research, is we ask people what they'd be willing to do, not what they're actually doing. And again, we could talk at length about methodologically how problematic talking about people's intentions and willingness is, because of course we don't necessarily know or want to report accurately on what we're actually doing. The most important thing is the last bit of that top paragraph where it says 90%, more than 90%, around 90% have no experience of renting, leasing or buying. This is the essence for us of the circular economy, and yet we're not doing it. And the policy and grey literature suggests that there is an engagement gap between consumers' expressed willingness to pay for more circular goods, and I missed out the last bit of that sentence, sorry, I didn't realise it when I sent the slides in. So there's a gap between what you say you'd be willing to do and what you're actually doing. And here we are again, we're back with this attitude and action gap, which we've been talking about in this field for how many years? 30, 40 years. And people have been talking to policymakers and trying to explain to them that actually it's not an information in, behavior out kind of model. It's way more complex than that. And the thing is, coming to this engagement gap, is it really the issue? I mean, that's a rhetorical question, of course it's not. So let's think back about that butterfly diagram. Is a frictionless transition where we close the engagement gap really what this is about? Let's look back at this and just really take in what this is saying. Because the consumer and user are the central nodes of all of this. All arrows point to or come from all of us. And I suppose one of the main points I want to make is it may very well be what's happening at the European level, or European Union level is weak, but actually in its full essence, this is already a radical agenda. This is very much, if we take this at sort of its face value of what it's representing, it's suggesting nothing less than a complete rethink of our socio-material relationships. That is radical transformation. What is interesting to me is how the radicalness, for want of a better word, of this, and you see this butterfly diagram repeated time and time and time again, that then gets interpreted in policy as not being that, as not being radical, as actually not having to think about, okay, so how does the user repair? How do we all repair? More than 90% of us aren't. So that's a huge social agenda. That's about education. That's about spaces of repair. That's about liability. That's about a lot of things. And yet the policy is talking about putting labels on your stuff in shops. I'm not saying that's not of value, but actually that's missing the point. So I'm always fascinated by how there's a very purposeful slide, or maybe just a kind of myopia or a denial about the radicalness of what is being suggested by this. Excuse me, I'm going to have to cough again. Okay. So my own work has been thinking through, it's all very well and good for me to sit here and say all this, is actually, well, how do we then start to be part of that conversation of re-injecting the actual essence of the circular economy back into circular economy policies? And some of the work I've started to do with colleagues in Manchester and Essex University is thinking about what are the implications for the circular economy for all of us. And so Katie Wheeler, whose book there is on the right, Household Recycling and Consumption Work, is part of this project, and that on the left there is a short article we had out about this. And it's really trying to make the point that the circular economy for all of us implicates more consumption work, by which we mean the labor that goes into our own consumption practices. So if you're going to repair something, that's work. If you're going to take something to a remanufacturing point, that's a form of labor. The question is, what are the implications for socioeconomic patterns and our spatiality in terms of how that labor plays out? And that is not part, or not a huge part, of how the circular economy is being talked about. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about jobs. We're talking about the labor of consumption. We all do it. You know, you go to IKEA or IKEA and you buy something and it's flat packed, you take it home and you build it. That's consumption work, because it's the labor that's unpaid and part of essential part of a practice of consumption. IKEA would not exist if we all weren't willing to take flat pack home and be swearing at something for hours because there's a bit missing or whatever. So that's what we're talking about. And we're trying to really think about what is the evidence around consumption work? You know, what does it take to be a circular consumer? What does it take to be able to repair and be part of these various loops, rather than just putting your recycling out once a week, as we do here in my street, and just thinking, oh, that's all taken care of, I don't have to think about this anymore. Okay. I've lost track of how much time I've got, but I will try not to keep talking for too much longer. So the question is, all right, this is all very well and good. We get it, but what now? How do we help expand that vision of, you know, what needs to change and what's at stake? And I'm just going to give a couple of examples. Obviously, I'm not going to suggest there's a kind of like a one size fits all. And I know you're going to be hearing more today about degrowth and sort of the richness of that concept. So I'm not going to go into those kinds of theoretical or conceptual debates, but certainly this is picking up on kind of the concepts of degrowth. But what can we do as individuals? What do I do as a researcher, sort of knowing all that or thinking all of that? And how do I take that forward? I certainly don't want to be someone just sitting in my room, writing papers, critiquing. I do to a point, but then I actually want to think, well, how do we then be part of that change? So here in Wales, we have a circular economy strategy called Beyond Recycling. And that's a really interesting title in and of itself. So I do get into the room quite regularly with the key policymakers around this, and that's the advantage of being in a relatively small country of 3+ million people. We're based in the capital, Cardiff, and we live very close to where the policymakers are. So surreptitious advantage, really. So making the most of those kinds of opportunities is very important. So Beyond Recycling signals very much that in Wales, we're aware of the fact that it's not just about recycling, but of course we're now slightly locked into, or very much locked into, the systems of recycling that have been set up over the decades that actually, and culturally, we're locked in to recycling is the answer, we put our bins out, all of that. So how do we move beyond that? And the text on the right is from that policy. And the one I'm not an expert in food waste and all the other points, but point 2 is where I really try and have this conversation with my colleagues in the Welsh Government and talk about this idea of enabling community action. So what the model of social change that they're talking about is very much about, if citizens want to do it, we will be there to some degree in terms of offering support. So, for example, they have a model of funding community initiatives where seed funding is available, but after a number of years, they have to become economically self-sufficient. Does that model of enabling really work when we're talking about profound socio-economic, socio-environmental transformation? No. So we're going back to a more sort of Keynesian economic pump priming perspective on what the government is there for, really. It's there for actually not just enabling, but actually creating. And there is definitely a reticence to be seen to be creating within communities, but it's not about dictating, it's actually about providing that sustained support. So, for example, continuing funding for more localized projects. And again, there is a reticence there. So that might not sound like much, but actually thinking about the implications of that, if we can get the Welsh Government to think a bit differently about what it means to enable, you can actually see ways in which that becomes more radical. And I mean radical by the sense of going to the roots of what the issue is. I'll give an example. I'm doing some work here where I live with a local library of things. It's called benthyg, which is the Welsh word for to borrow. And one of the challenges they've had is actually finding a space. So you can borrow a food dehydrator, you can borrow a strimmer, you can borrow a kid's bouncy castle, all those things. Where do they actually store this? And it's that point at which we need some strong government support to be able to facilitate these kinds of practices. And they're often just not there to be able to do that. And those small things like that actually then can suggest a more spatial radical transformation. So that's my work. I consider it kind of, my duty as an activist academic to forego publishing endless papers and actually do the work to sit in the room with policymakers and go and talk to benthyg and do some research with benthyg and support them to think about those kinds of small scale but potentially quite impactful transformations. So this is my last slide. And another example I want to give is, again, talking about working in your own backyard. And I'm not suggesting a kind of local parochialism here, because these small examples tell us a lot, and we can share these practices and think about how we can impact elsewhere. I work for a huge institution. We have about 30,000 undergraduate students. I can't remember how many postgrads, 3,000 to 4,000 postgrads, several thousand members of staff. We're one of the biggest employers in Cardiff, in Wales, after the NHS. So what are we doing about it? The university has made a lot of promises and is doing a lot of stuff. The environmental sustainability strategy was recast in 2021. But I'm working on a project, again, with Benthyg and also Repair Cafe Wales, to think about how do we actually bring these practices into the institution that we exist in. So there's lots of talk about academic travel, that's fine, doing work on that, about our estates and buildings and how inefficient they are. They really are, because we're in there's a lot of listed buildings we're part of, very inefficient, that's fine. What I'm interested in is linking up the circular economy practices with our actual practices within the university. So on the left, we have the university's invested a huge amount of money into a remaker space that's literally just opened. So we have lots of tools and 3D printers and all that malarkey. And that's great. But what's interesting is that's a capital investment, but there's no money left for employing people. And I'm not criticizing, per se, this is often how it falls out, you take the money where it is. But how do we then optimize the capacity of this space and bring in our student body? So we're very much focused on education for sustainability. That's fine, but sitting students in the room and talking at them for 2 hours about climate change, if you come back to the engagement or the value action gap, it's not going to make much difference to their actual practices. How do we actually start to create embodied and experiential learning around the circular economy within our universities? And when I ask that question, I often get stunned silences in some of the rooms that I sit in, because it seems to be beyond the pale of our institution. And again, I'm not criticizing Cardiff University per se. I'm saying it's about how we were set up and the kind of lock-in that we have institutionally to the current practices that we do. So just to kind of start to wrap up, what I'm saying is that, as I've already said, the circular economy in its very essence is already radical. And what I'm interested in is not how do we turn the policy itself or the framework itself into radicalness, it's actually how do we remind and re-inject and start to change what is going on under the auspices of the circular economy back to its more radical roots. And that is proving extremely challenging, but I am a naive optimist, and I choose to be, in terms of what's possible, because I have no interest in just sitting back and just being snarky about other people's work. I think we need to dive in. And I'm certainly seeing, in terms of the reactions you get from posing these questions in different spaces, people starting to think differently about how we go about our own practices. So that's a very sort of practical, I didn't mean to make it about, I'm going to talk about myself, but what I'm trying to do is actually take it away perhaps from too conceptual and abstract debates into thinking about, well, what do we do about this if we know that there's promise, that there's potential there, that things are happening already, things are changing. How do we be part of that change, knowing what we know about what needs to happen, rather than sitting back? And it's proving very interesting, and it's also, very exciting to think about, well, actually, I now have some momentum to get our students into giving them repairing skills, getting them to run a repair cafe, getting them to come and do stuff in the remaker space that they can then take forward with them into their life post-university. But it's all very much nascent at the moment in time, and it's all quite hard work, really, but it's fun. Okay, so I think I'm coming close to my time. Thanks for listening. There's some of the references. I don't know I can share the slides with participants or whomever. Some interesting papers there. There's one I just saw at the bottom there, Korvalek et al., Critiques of the Circular Economy. That's a really nice roundup of some of the things that I've been talking about in the Journal of Industrial Ecology. And there's my URL at the bottom. Please feel free to drop me a line. Again, sorry, I can't be there. But yeah, happy to respond to any emails or whatever in the future, and any questions now. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Thanks.
Thank you, Kersty. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your talk. We almost have a half an hour of questions.
Okay.
We've got the first questions online, but maybe we start with the audience here in Ljubljana. I think we have a first question in the back there.
Hi, Ricardo, PhD student from Uppsala University. Thank you very much for the very inspiring presentation. I wanted to ask you about something that you showed at the end, this remaker space that you showed. And you said that is something that you're doing within the University of Cardiff, if I understood well. And that it sure is something that brings like the remaking down to like the individual level, and it works well at like university, in a university space where people have like enough time on their hand. And I was wondering like how can this be extended to like people that might be working and also taking care of a family and they do not have the same amount of free time to invest in something like a remaker space?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I might have given the wrong impression. It's not actually, we're just starting that project trying to get students coming to the remaker space. And I think it's interesting that that assumption that students have a lot of time is one, like with another hat on, I'm director of learning and teaching in our school. And it's interesting how the number of students that are actually juggling work. A lot of our students do work a lot of the time because of the financial setup here in the UK now, you have to pay for everything. So I'm not saying that you're wrong. Obviously, having kids and a mortgage and a job is very different. But I think pointing to what's already gone on around repair cafes and remaker spaces in communities, in fact, actually, they are thriving more outside of university spaces than within them, which I think is really intriguing. So repair cafes have worked really well. I live in a place called Penarth, which is outside of Cardiff. We have a monthly repair cafe on the Sunday where people turn up. We don't have a remaker space, but there is one in Newport, that's sort of next city along from Cardiff. So I'm not saying it's all fine because, as I've said, the government here in Wales could do more to support those spaces, I think. But I'm not sure that it's true that the university students have it easy or it's easier within a university. I actually think in some ways, given our remit and our historical non-focus on embodied learning, you know, we still very much, like, students turn up, they sit in a room, we talk at them, we give them some seminars, they go away. That's the sort of social science. Obviously, if you're working in a lab or learning to, you know, to do optometry or something, it's different. But from a social science perspective, we still very much have a stand and deliver model of education, which is kind of weird if you think about it. And we're thinking more about how to bring that kind of embodied experiential learning into the degree, and the sort of remaker spaces is just part of that. Actually, it's not the whole agenda. So sorry, I'm waffling, but I suppose I would say I struggle with the premise of the question because I don't think that's an accurate representation of how students and how young people's lives are. But I think there's a definite difference between a community and a university model. And that's what I want to get to the essence of in this project, is that we haven't thought that clearly and critically about what those differences are. Why does a repair cafe work in Penarth, but Cardiff Metropolitan University tried to start one for their students and it failed? I don't think that's an issue of time per se. I think it's an issue of institutions and what students expect when they come to university. So it's just a project that's starting. I probably get back to me in a year and I probably got a lot more cogent things to say about that question, but I think it's a very important one. And you're actually kind of hitting the nub of what we're trying to get at. Sorry, I waffle, just stop me if I keep talking.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question here from the audience.
Thank you very much. My name is Felipe Corral. I am a PhD researcher at TU Berlin. So just hearing your response to the first question, I was reminded of a book by David Graeber and David Wengrow called The Dawn of Everything, that as part of the argument that it develops is that for the better part of human history, technological development has been a kind of a community-led project that has been, to put it some way, playful. So do you think that perhaps one of the reasons why this challenge that you recognize in comparing the university environment as a site for community innovation or for technological innovation versus these community-based alternatives perhaps has to do with that perspective, that kind of our academic system tries to concentrate knowledge between the four walls of classrooms in a very institutionalized and detached way versus a more empirical, again, playful, very decentralized manner. Because when I was seeing your slides and hearing your lecture, it seems like the challenge we have as a society in terms of circular economy and the hardware and software innovations that we need to do to get there are too big to attempt to do them only in academia. We kind of need everyone to begin doing these things. So how do we break out of classrooms?
Gosh, that's such a good point. That's brilliant. Thank you. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And actually, just this morning, I'm just going to try and find it on my email. There was the circular economy, where is it? Platform network put out a call for proposals for social innovations for a fair, green and digital transition, talking about looking at projects that develop and test integrated and exclusive social innovation. Now, I know that's not what you're talking about, but it's interesting because I think that starts to unpack that a little bit and starting to realize that actually the circular economy is very much manufacturing led as it stands. And that is very much about someone somewhere else who's got a kind of techie science background solving things for us. And one of the problems there is it seems to be that there's this misunderstanding of like the life cycle of products that actually I keep reading, and I have friends in work in sustainable design saying that it's inaccurate to say that 80% of a product's energy use and resources are locked in during the design and manufacturing phase. It's not, it's a lot about use. So we've misunderstood our own sort of socio-economic, socio-material relations. Actually, it's as much as how we use stuff as how we make it. But that wasn't the point you were making. And I think that idea of playfulness, when you said that, it just made me smile, because that absolutely is the antithesis of how we view education. It's very goal-driven, it's very serious, it causes a lot of stress. Like, I can't believe some of the sort of stress and mental health issues that our students are under. And it's because they're very much like, this is serious, everything's at stake, you have to do what the system, you have to perform what the system tells you. And so there is no space there to experiment, to try and to fail, to come to remaker spaces and mess around, as it might be considered, within that very strict sort of framework. And I think that's where bringing in these organizations like Repair Cafe and Library of Things into the university space is really important, because it starts to break down those barriers between the institution and the community in a way that we have not been good at. And I'm not just talking about Cardiff, I'm talking about universities. I mean, maybe it's different elsewhere, but we have a very institutionalized approach to institutions here. So absolutely, how do we encourage that kind of playful engagement with these very serious issues? And yeah, I don't know what to say. I think you're absolutely right. I'll just share one story. I used to work at Oxford Uni, and I took some of our master's students, down to London, and we went to a tear down and remake a space in London. And we had a lecture about circular economy and material pathways and all of that. And then the students got to do a tear down, which is basically you take an old computer and you try and pull out what could be reused and remanufactured and recycled. And I've never seen them so excited and alive. Like literally, it was so funny. I just stood back and they had their glasses on and they were like really into it. And I just thought, wow, this was quite something. And then when we talked about it afterwards, they said they learned more from that experience of actually seeing how difficult it is. We think recycling's easy. Everything just falls into its little waste categories. No, it's not. It's really, really hard to do recycling well. So you give someone a phone or a laptop and say, okay, get the gold out for me. And they're like, you can't. And just having that challenge and being able to experience it was worth anything I could tell them in the classroom. But we are still not good at doing that. And to me, as a university lecturer, I consider that one of my challenges is how do I bring that in? So anyway, great point, absolutely. Thanks for that.
There will be another one.
Hi, I'm Eric Swingedow from the University of Manchester. Thank you very much for your wonderful contribution. Like the University of Cardiff, the University of Manchester also tries to do its marketing gimmick to become circulatory and sustainable. Nonetheless, is this attempt not fatally undermined by the very business model, the corporate model of our own universities? And I can't speak for Cardiff, but I can certainly speak for Manchester. The very business model of my university is predicated upon the global circulation of student bodies as cash cows. 20–30% of our graduate students have to be international because they pay so much higher fees. Now, this global circulation of cash generating bodies is utterly and completely in contradiction to the kind of attempts to circular sustainability that my university portrays itself as being excellent at. So my question therefore is what my university, and perhaps yours, does in terms of nurturing these circulatory practices, not just a cheap marketing trick in the face of the very, very business logic upon which the existence of our universities is predicated?
Yeah, great point. And I totally agree with you. And again, yeah, I mean, I personally and institutionally struggle with that one because it feels very much, well, we are parts of very hypocritical institutions, and the big sort of different silos within that institutions. One part has a very sincere and honest, agenda around this, and the other part is like, absolutely not. There is no way we are ever going to de-internationalize our pool of students because it would be a fatal economic flaw. So it's about path dependencies. We are part of this path dependency of marketing of bodies, and I like that the way you put it, Eric. That's really evocative. We are, and I don't know what the solution to that is, because I mean, ultimately we put ourselves in a position where, as if we de-escalate from that model, jobs will be lost, because that's how we set up the whole premise. We have expanded and we've kept expanding, and there's talk about degrowth, right? I mean, universities have to degrow if we're going to be able to actually genuinely be sustainable, but we never will, because ultimately we've set up pathways, and the resistance within universities to this change is profound. And I always say to my colleagues, it's, the irony of us lecturing about this stuff but not doing it. Can we just sit with that and actually really think about how we would explain that to students? Like, how is it that we are perpetuating such huge ecological footprints whilst telling students about ecological footprints in terms of in terms of what's about? So I don't know what to say other than I totally agree with you. The only thing I can kind of see is some kind of forced collapse of the global education market, which might be on its way, which would be unfortunate for a lot of people's employment. But we've already had, various issues with international recruitment, as a lot of universities do. So maybe it's on its way. Maybe a forced shrinkage might be the way that this is all going to be addressed. I don't think it's going to be addressed consciously by institutions, because they can't afford to, because again, we set up that past dependency that started many decades ago about just constant expansion. And as we know, what has to expand eventually deflates, and that's probably coming, which is a very gloomy message, but I think it's not inaccurate. So yeah, great point. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, now we move to one question from Zoom. First, there's a rather technical question from Kelsey Perlman. Who are the consumers that are referenced in the 90% figure of those who have no experience renting, leasing, buying secondhand? Is this for the EU? So I think this is a very technical question.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I didn't want to go into the details of that particular study. Yes, it is. It was a EU-wide, now I'm trying to pull the figures. I think it was over 6,000 respondents from across various EU countries. I don't think it was all EU countries, but I think it might have been a sample of about 10 countries. So a reasonable-ish, I mean, we can talk about sample sizes, but it was across the EU. And you do see, of course, regional and in-country variations within that. So I would encourage you to have a look at that report, because it breaks down the data in terms of what's going on. But I think it's safe to say that even within country, taking into account within country variations, it's still a very low level of engagement with repair across the European Union. So yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Yes, and another question from Johnny Grünsch. I have a question regarding the politics of consumption work. On the one hand, your argument about how the user or consumer is at the center of the circular economy and consumption work is not emphasized as quite compelling. On the other hand, much other critiques of the circular economy focuses on how depoliticized it is. Consumption has also been seen as a kind of unpolitical environmentalism. Do you think that this is a mistake and consumption work is, or at least could be, political?
I'm trying to see if I understand the question. Do I understand the question? I think consumption work is political. I'm not sure if I gave the impression that it's not, because, okay, what do we mean by politics here? But the assumption, the requirement of the current economic system is that we are all able and willing in various ways to undertake unpaid labor to enable these economic practices to persist. That's political. So I wasn't trying to suggest it's not. And the depoliticization comes in the invisibility of that labor, that we perhaps are, I'm not saying we're not aware of it, but the actual implications that somebody somewhere is making a pretty significant profit out of our willingness to drag home flat pack furniture and do it ourselves. And that in itself is part of a economic political perspective on who we are as consumers and users. So I think it always is political in the sense of what we mean by politics there. So I'm not quite sure actually about what the question is asking, I've got to be honest, because I'm not sure that I've said it is not political. Could I get some clarification on that question, if that's possible?
Yes, I think the guest on Zoom has to write some clarification. In the meanwhile, we move on to a question from the live audience here in Ljubljana.
Hello, I'm Dalia Egent. I'm philosopher from University of Ljubljana. Thank you for a great presentation. I love what you're doing. So I actually have two questions, and the first one might sound like a criticism, but I'm mostly just interested if you have any information about any, I guess, sister projects or any sources about the industrial side of circular economy. As I said, I understand that your area is different. It's on the consumer side. I'm just a bit leery, I guess you could say, about placing too much responsibility about repairing and recycling on the consumer. I mean, we know for a fact that in capitalist economy, it is cheaper especially for any type of big multinational business to produce massive amounts of cheap products, and if everything doesn't get sold, which it usually doesn't, it just gets thrown away. This is cheaper than scaling down the production. So that would be my first question, how we force these big businesses to stop producing so much and to start producing products that can be repaired in the first place. I'm sure many of you have heard there is now a big international civil suit against Apple because we now have solid proof that they deliberately make their computers and phones in such a way that they stop working at a certain point. And yes, of course, you can get some kind of, very smart IT person who can repair this for you, but for most people, it's absolutely not accessible. You cannot do it yourself. And if you don't know that it's even possible to do, you're obviously not going to do it. So yeah, that would be my first question. And my second question is, well, it's more of a suggestion. I think that it might pay off if we would emphasize the improvement in quality of life, in comfort, in happiness that can come with recycling, repairing, buying less, because I mean, I don't know, I started buying secondhand clothes because it meant I could afford better quality clothes, and that makes me feel better. I'm very happy that it's a more like ecological choice, but I think it doesn't sound good. Okay, we would all like to think that, oh, it's great to be self-sacrificing for ethical purposes, for the planet, but most people are going to have a much easier time doing the better thing if the better thing feels better, if it makes us happier. So just as a suggestion, and yeah, a talking point maybe. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Really, really great points. Gosh, we could spend the rest of the day talking about all of this. I mean, just to come to your first point, I am mindful as you spoke that I never wanted to give the impression of that the consumer, all of us, are responsible or should be responsible. We are being made responsible in many ways. So, there's a huge literature on the responsibilization, to use a very awkward word, that predates the circular economy, goes all the way back to this idea of consumer sovereignty, that they're giving us what we want. Well, we know that's absolute nonsense. So we are, as consumers, manipulated and all of that. There is a lot going on in terms of working with businesses. A lot of this, as you can appreciate and will understand, is very softly. Everyone is still very nervous about strong regulation around business in terms of provoking capital flight or whatever. But certainly within the European Union, this sort of enshrinement of right to repair and what that then does in terms of business models is starting to infiltrate through. But there's certainly a bigger politics of how we deal with, the practices of businesses that is at the essence of the circular economy. And you're absolutely right. And I didn't talk about that. And that's sort of not necessarily what I focus on, but I'm certainly not suggesting that, oh, don't worry about businesses, we'll take care of everything, because of course, you know, as I say, you know, we are manipulated as consumers to buy stuff that we don't need and is basically crap. So we have to get away from that. But there is a lot of work going on there. In terms of the industrial side, there's various people. I can think of a whole university, Pauline Dietz, DEUTZ, has done a lot of work around the kind of the industrial side in terms of sort of human geography, industrial side of the circular economy. So you could look at her work. But I think it's also worth thinking about, like, right to repair. A lot of this came from grassroots social pressure of the social movements for actually instigating pressure on these organizations. It's not necessarily coming from government. It's not coming from the businesses themselves, not the big businesses anyway. We could talk about, you know, smaller startups and stuff. So actually it's interesting that that has actually started to become central. So the right to repair and that sort of pressure on Apple are coming through social movements, but also the use of legal instruments to force them to do things. So I absolutely agree with what you were saying. We do not certainly ever want to give the impression that it's all down to you and me, and if we're not doing it, then it's our fault, because that is some awful reinterpretation of the notion of consumer sovereignty, which we know is absolute. I won't swear. So good points, yeah. And then coming on to your quality of life, absolutely, absolutely. And that is what resonates with people. The point I sort of always struggle with is where do we start to have these conversations about that? Because, say, for example, I teach a third-year module called Climate Change and Environmental Governance, and I talk about consumption there. And I start to talk to my students, who are all average age 21-ish, 2021, about well-being and consumption, and what actually does it do, like psychologically, endocrinologically, or whatever, when you buy something, that kind of thrill, and then it's gone, and then it's wasted. And actually, where do we invest our time, and the well-being that comes, and the feeling of accomplishment that comes from going around secondhand shops and finding something of value, and rethinking our material sort of products that we own. There's a very difficult conversations to have, because a lot of students will interpret that as telling them they can't have stuff. So at what point and where is this about what we talk about in schools? Is it how we raise kids? Is it too late by the time we get to adults? Well, I don't think it is, but where are those spaces that actually happen? And I agree with you in terms of the environmental message not being predominant. And I'll just use my own community as an example. Where I live, there is a network of people called Growing Together. And basically it is people who have gardens or allotments and the public spaces, and actually thinking about how we use the land, and just collectively agreeing to grow food, share our saplings and offcuttings, and share practices and share knowledge. The environmental implications of lots of people doing that are potentially huge, but nobody talks about the environment. We're talking about the satisfaction, the land, the nerdiness of it all, like, you know, having a real sort of hobby that you're into. The environment doesn't really come into it in that kind of sterile climate change way. It's actually more about re-engaging with, again, our sort of milieu rather than environment. And that is where you can hit home with a lot of people. But then we get into issues of who has access to that, who has the time for that. And we could talk about, you know, poverty and class and all of that. And certainly in this Growing Together community, it is very white and middle class. So that comes back to that. Where do we actually start to have these conversations elsewhere? And that's a real challenge. But it's a great point. Anyway, thank you.
Yes, I think we have time for one more question from the audience, and then maybe one more from Zoom.
Thanks for your talk. I have another question regarding the remaker space. And I'm involved in a community workshop, and in my experience, I think it's not possible to separate the social prefigurative elements from the materialities of the workshop. And I'm pretty sure that this is like one of the important transformative points of something like that. It also affects our social relations to each other. And it's also maybe what makes people addicted to it or to come and do something there. And I'm wondering if you implement it in that way or like within such an institution. For me, it's likely that this element is, becomes missing. And I wonder if it's then like only a technocratic solution anymore, like, you know what I mean? And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I'm genuinely not sure what the implications are. What you'd never want to do is to move something like a remaker space into that, oh, here's another way you can achieve a degree outcome. Oh, here's another way you can tick off a box on your CV to show that you've done some extracurricular doobie-doo, whatever. But you're right, it is a potential, almost an inevitable danger in some ways of institutionalizing. And I think that's one of the things I'm trying to push against, is not, like some of my colleagues were saying, oh, well, we'll use the remaker space as part of seminars. And I was saying, well, to do what? You can't just bring students over for an hour and show them stuff. They're basically saying, bring them across and we'll show them how the tech works, and that's a seminar. I was like, that's not a seminar. There's no learning from that, because they can look up that stuff online. But then when it becomes part of their degree program, it loses those kinds of qualities that you're talking about. And I think you're right. I think it's a real challenge. I suppose my point is that the tech is there. The university has invested this time, well, actually not time, they've invested money in the tech. And I want to be part of that conversation about how we use it, because you're absolutely right. The danger is then it gets so institutionalized that it loses the very elements of that experiential learning that we want it to make the difference. I don't have any easy answer to that, other than I'm very mindful of that. And it's a challenge I'm going to be facing going forward as this project unfolds in the next year. But you put it in a very eloquent way. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, we continue with one question from Zoom, from Lydia. Thanks for the informative presentation. I like the idea of unpacking the circular economy in its abstract form into how to think about going about it and enabling action. In my experience, it is often easy to start, but sustaining the behavior change over time is not always easy. Any suggestions? I am aware that joining a local community that shares the same values and practice as yours can improve that, but it is difficult if the current society and economy as a whole has not yet completely changed. It's tough going against the grain.
Oh gosh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I wish I had an easy answer, a silver bullet for that, because, you know, I think we could all go home then. That's the difference between behavior change and system change, isn't it? And so many documents now, you know, coming out of these big institutions are talking about transformation and system change, while really a lot of what they're talking about in terms of you and I is behavior change, and they're not the same thing. And again, trying to make those points. And I'm not saying that there's a deliberate ruse going on. I genuinely think, like when I talk to people in the Welsh government, these are fabulous people doing great work and working really hard with the best intentions. But sometimes things like behavior change, they think of as system change. They think what they're basically thinking is that if enough people do this, we'll get a groundswell. So it's all these kinds of ideas that we have knocking around about bottom up and groundswell and all of that. And my point is that actually those practical barriers of, well, where is your library of things, and spatially, how do you actually access your local repair cafe, and is there childcare, and is there a bus? all that stuff, that's not groundswell because communities aren't in charge of that. So in that sense, behavior change is by definition unsustainable because it's not being supported by actual system change. And it's very easy for me to sit here and say, because of course it's massively challenging. But I think even making people more aware of that distinction is really important. And again, how do you sustain it? I don't know, because the danger is that then comes back to that individualizing and responsibilization of people saying, well, you've got to try hard, you've got to make time. Well, no, that's not the message we want to be putting across. None of this is frictionless, to come back to that word. It costs us all in terms of time and labor, but we have to feel that that cost is being met by an investment elsewhere in these practices, that actually the Welsh government or whoever sees those costs and is able to match you in many ways in terms of their sort of spatial and institutional investments. So that's what true transformation looks like. It isn't the accumulation of lots of behavior change, because as you say, that's not sustainable, which doesn't really answer your question, sorry. I don't know how we get it other than keep having those conversations and keep pressurizing and daring to be the one in the room that says, hold on a second, you've got your model, you've got your theory of change wrong, which is often what it comes down to. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kersty. I think you have very many like-minded people who bring up the topics here in the room. I think we give a big applause to Kersty and then go into the break.
Thanks everyone, thanks for the questions. Have a good coffee, bye.